connecting. So I now would like to say welcome everyone, and I'll pass across to John Martin to start the proceedings for this morning. Over to you, Yellow Wiggle.
Okay, thanks Fredo. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm John Martin, head of the Oral History Collection and Engagement team. We've had a name change. Look, given today's topic, it's quite relevant to the oral history program, so I'm delighted to be able to launch today's webinar titled Tips, Tricks and Experiences in Doing Interviews. So it is with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce and extend a very warm welcome to our two presenters, Louise Williams and Michael Veitch. Good morning to you both. I know a lot of people have been looking forward to hearing this presentation. Yeah, all very good. Now, look, I do have a little spiel. Insofar as introductions are concerned, the normal protocol would see me spending a little bit of time going over the presenters' careers in reasonable detail. With two presenters such as Louise and Michael, who have extensive and successful careers, we would probably need another webinar session. So I've done a little bit of surgery on their bios, to which I've arrived at a very abridged introduction for both of them, but hopefully a decent glimpse of how talented our two presenters are. So I'm going to start with you, Louise, very briefly. An exceptionally accomplished journalist who, among the many assignments working for the Sydney Morning Herald, you've spent extensive time in difficult circumstances as a foreign correspondent in Southeast Asia. You did a lot of time there indeed, 10 years. And you were covering conflict and civil unrest. How good would that have been? Would have been tough. But look, you have many awards, and among those awards, Louise is the recipient of the prestigious Walkley Award for Excellence in Journalism. To me, that's a little bit like the Brownlow Medal for AFL. So pretty good, pretty good. Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that Louise is also a successful author, having written many books and making contributions to many more. And indeed, we have entrusted Louise to the role of lead author on our own publication, Then, Now and Always, which is one of the Air Force's centenary publications being released in 2021. And then finally, can I say, when Louise is not writing or editing books, you're a communications consultant, but this is something that I picked up that I had to mention. It would appear that through some of the tutelage you've given, you've successfully secured $140 million worth of competitive grants for the likes of the non-profit movements, which that's quite amazing, Louise. So that just goes to show you're obviously a great writer. So well done on that front. Now, Michael Veitch, if I can move on to you. Now, if you think you know the name out there, you probably do. Think actor, think comedian, then a string of successful Australian comedy sketches. And we've mentioned some of those already before this. Degeneration, Fast Forward and Full Frontal. Michael, they're going to follow you forever. But they were exceptionally entertaining, especially for us now, looking back. Well, anyway, that's our man for today. Look, after success in comedy, Michael has followed a lifelong interest in aviation and has become a very successful author. And Michael, I think without realising it, an advocate for Air Force, because many of your titles, such as Flak, 25 short stories, World War II accounts of some of our airmen, and 44 Days, Battle of Milne Bay, they both provide fascinating, compelling accounts of ordinary airmen living in extraordinary times, as you've put in your book. But you've sent that message out to the public, and we didn't do that. And it just goes to show and retell the magnificent stories of some of our forebears. But when you're not authoring, Michael, you've successfully turned your hand to theatre productions, where you not only produce them, but you then perform them, but all by yourself on the stage. And I've been there to see it in Hellship, and it's quite amazing. You're an exceptionally gifted performer on the stage, and some of those accounts of our World War II veterans from the book Flak, where you've performed on stage, have been outstanding. And they've just reminded everybody of the the trials and tribulations that we would have been going through in World War II. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's my very abridged introduction of Louise and Michael. I hope I've done them both justice. If you look on the websites, you will see an extensive bio for both. But now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Louise, who is going to provide part one of today's webinar. Louise. Oh, you're on mute. No, Louise,
How's that?
That's great. That's
yes,
great.
I did unmute myself earlier. Thank you very much for coming. I have to say, not the world's greatest fan of Zoom. I would love to meet you all. And hopefully at some point we will maybe be able to, I don't know, come together in a little round circle of chairs or something like that. First thing I wanted to say about oral histories is really give you guys a huge pat on the back. I've done quite a lot of research in my career. One of the books that I wrote was an investigation into the fate of my uncle, who was the chief carpenter in The Great Escape, and that required a great deal of historic research. And I can't tell you how valuable good oral histories are. They are absolutely essential for continuing on the story of your organisation. And there's, you know, many people that Michael would agree, they're absolutely fantastic. So thank you for doing them. They're important for the RAF, of course they are. And the other thing I think, don't ever underestimate how important they are for your interview subjects. I've bumped into people who said, oh, my grandfather was in such and such, and they interviewed him about it. They, presumably being the RAF or the, you know, well, the Australian War Memorial, but they're really, really important in recognising the importance of what people do. So, you know, you're giving back as well as gathering in this process. So I think it's fantastic. Second thing would be just to say that I know you're experienced, all of you. So, you know, apologies in advance if some of what I tell you, you already know, but I think it's better to try and, you know, tell the whole story. So Fredo will be glad to hear this. I think that interviewing is as much a science as it is an art. A lot of it can be reverse engineered. You can plan it out strategically. It doesn't necessarily need to be something that you come naturally to, because it doesn't necessarily come naturally to everybody. If I was teaching one of my classes at uni, I'd probably say to them, interviewing, what's the very first thing you should ask yourself? Who is my audience? Now you're in a really interesting position, because who is your audience? You know, something that's ordinary today will be gold in, you know, 50 years time. You might, all you need to see is your kids laughing at your clothes from the 1980s that were still in the wardrobe, in my case. And you'll see that distance and time really make everything interesting. So your position in terms of imagining your audience is the sky's the limit. You know, maybe we'll have a filmmaker making this amazing documentary about the time when pilots actually flew planes. People flew planes, amazing. Or, you know, it doesn't matter. So what I think that means is that you have to imagine that your audience will really require a very complete record. They won't know necessarily what it feels like to be in the shoes of people today. So you'll have to provide, I think, quite a lot of detail, but I'll get to that in a second. So then the second thing I'd probably say is, how does what you do today engage people in the future? How is it that history becomes a Pearl Harbor movie? How is it that history becomes Hacksaw Ridge? You know, one guy who, you know, goes into battle with no weapon because he's a pacifist, for example. You know, there are these amazing stories out there, and stories go forward and become history or well-known history really because they fit into storytelling traditions that are eons old. Storytelling traditions haven't changed that much. Technology has, delivery platforms have, but what makes a story hasn't really changed that much. So if you're trying to generate the type of content that I think that will travel into the future, I think you have to think about what it is as human beings that we like as stories. So I don't want to make it sound trite, but I think that we've been gravitating towards the older storytelling techniques, you know, for as I said, for eons. And we gravitate towards stories in which you can identify a clear moral line, good versus bad, us versus them, particularly, of course, if we position ourselves or our people on the right side, stories in which we identify with the winning team or the right team. And in that camp are heroes and heroines. And I think that you live in a sort of media saturated age. So you probably, I think you're probably pretty familiar with what makes a story. But I think it's sometimes interesting to go back over it. And there's my husband works in the film industry, and there's a sort of joke in the film industry, particularly from Hollywood, that there's only really 6 stories in the whole world. And I think there's a few more than that, but anyway. And we just keep telling the same short list of stories over and over again with different characters. You might think this is an exaggeration, but I'll go through the list. So the first one is man bites dog. What does that mean? That just means we're interested in stories that turn our expectations on their head. And I think that you'll recognize that. Something that is out of the ordinary, somebody who is doing something that is out of the ordinary that we didn't expect. So someone challenging the status quo. Of course, good versus evil. So, you know, war, so long as you're on the right side, or peacekeeping, disaster relief, all of those things fit in really well with them. Triumph over adversity, that's, one that we're very interested in. For example, you know, we're really interested in the guy who's out in his garage and he has hardly any education and he's, developing Microsoft. We're not that interested in someone who's had all the privileges in the world and then is successful. David and Goliath. We love that. Australia, particularly the underdog. The journey. How did we get there? How did you get to where you are going? And that's pretty interesting. Just as a little sidebar, I had a couple of wonderful interview sessions with Leo Davies, and he told me this amazing story. I thought it was an amazing story anyway. Was as a kid in country Victoria, he would get his school report at the end of every year and he would post it off to RAF recruiting. And he'd get a nice little mail back saying, thank you very much, Sonny, whatever, come and see us when you're 18. But that kind of detail is absolutely gold, because that goes to the journey of someone like that who ends up as a chief of Air Force, right? So it's an amazing story. The other one, of course, boy meets girl. You might have thought that the RAAF is immune to this, but I saw a beautiful photo of a couple. They're coming off different planes somewhere in, I think it might have been in Mogadishu, and they were crossing paths on the tarmac for 20 minutes. So you've got some great stories in there like that now, of course. So the RAF stacks up pretty well in terms of stories. People also, the general public, such as myself, who is not an expert on anything, we love stories that test our own imaginations and emotions. So we like to consider fear and courage from the safety and comfort of our armchairs. So we actually like to go and look over the cliff with a little safety harness on. So that's why we love stories about people who are out there actually doing the stuff that we really care about, but probably are too scared to do ourselves. That goes on to, I think the next point is that I think the essential ingredient in stories is people, because that's the only way a general audience is ever going to relate to your story. You can have a very important geopolitical story, but unless you have a character, which is, your oral histories, saying, come with me into this story, it won't be nearly as engaging. And the sort of rule of thumb for people is we love ordinary people doing extraordinary things. So we love people who've you know, gone and enlisted, they've done X, Y, and Z. And the converse is also true, is we actually love extraordinary people doing ordinary things, which is why we love celebrity divorces, we love celebrity diets, we love princesses and princesses, you know, doing things like flying in a helicopter, or, you know, obviously for the military service of the royal princes. So we love all that sort of thing. So this is how, I guess, you connect people to stories. So that's where oral histories are a really important part of an organisation's history. So the other thing is that we love people's backstories. You know, as I mentioned, the school reports, and we love the adversity. We love people who've overcome that adversity. And I just brought I thought it was quite a good quote in terms of storytelling. I'm sure you're all familiar with Gordon Ramsay, very sort of angry chef, sort of stomping around the kitchen. And the quote is this, is Ramsay has framed his life as an allegory of triumph over adversity. Now, understandably, he wants to concentrate on triumph. Without the adversity, however, it's just the story of a man who was very good at cooking and not gay. Which I think, you know, it sort of really sums it up, that you don't just want to tell the good story, because the whole point of a story is this struggle to overcome, to get to where you're going. And it's not just this, you know, I guess, and it isn't, it really is in life, but it's not just this kind of highway to success. So there you go. So when you have thought about what the story might be and how the interview you're doing might fit into this storytelling genre, I think that, you know, in my opinion, and Michael's probably going to have other opinions. I notice he's put his handsome portrait up again, so I reckon he's off getting some coffee. I'm just kidding, Michael. So I think just to really simplify it, I think you need 3 ingredients. So your first ingredient is probably the obvious one, is you need the facts, you need the chronology, you need the facts about somebody's life. But you also need the visuals, you also need the imagery, so that people might actually be able to imagine being there with your interview subject at a crucial time. If your interview subject's done something really interesting, and I'll get onto this in a minute, how might the interview provide the material to historians in the future that will enable people to imagine what it was like? And a CV, as you well know, isn't going to do that, not just saying I did X, Y, and Z. Then if possible, and again, not always easy, is what about the emotion? What were they feeling? How was that moment for them and for the people around them? And that will be what I think distinguishes an oral history that is useful from one that bounces out of your files and makes it into one of Michael's books, for example. And, you know, people who become famous through their experiences often are famous because they can tell a good story. There's lots of people doing the same thing, but they know how to tell that story. So I've pulled out a couple of examples of what an oral history might give you, and then we can think about maybe how you might reverse engineer this. I did a lot of research for my book on The Great Escape in the UK, and I must say that the huge number of books on World War II, there was a question that we canvassed at the History and Heritage Conference in Canberra, was why is there so much stuff written about World War II? And I think it's 2 things. One is that it's a great story because we were on the right side. It's a story of incredible courage because it was very, very dangerous to be doing what you were doing then. But the Brits were awesome at keeping records, and they were awesome at doing oral histories. And to a certain extent, so was the Australian War Memorial and the RAF. Many more, the Brits were in charge of us then, as you remember. So there was lots of great material. And then that, I think, has really enlivened a lot of the next generation of World War II books. I'll read you a couple of World War II descriptions. So this one is about fear. These two are about fear, actually. The newspaper picture of the laughing aviator carelessly risking his life is not really a flattering likeness. It is no compliment to a man to say he is too insensitive to know when he is in danger. The airmen preserve a rigid appearance of anyway, and good spirits, but one soons to realize they are living in a state of tension. So that gives people a really good insight that you've got, on the one hand, a sort of public image of confidence. But what you really want to know, if you're reading a book or if you're making a movie, is that this is a human being. This is a person who is just like you and me. And then you automatically engage with that person. And that is how your story will come out. I've got another one that's by Roald Dahl, who I'm sure you know is an author. You probably all know he was a World War II fighter pilot as well. Does everyone know that? And of course, you know, I wouldn't expect you to be getting quotes like his, because he is an extremely good author, but I'll read it out anyway because it's worth it. He's saying, fear creeps closer and closer like a cat stalking a sparrow. It does not, however, pounce, but simply whispers in a pilot's ear. At first, the whisper is heard only at night, then at times during the day. Then you hear it all day and all night and all of the time. Most pilots accepted that even in a single engine, one-man plane, there was always an extra passenger along for the ride. So, I mean, that's, you know, a beautiful way of describing that as well. I've got another one here, which is, I'm pretty sure this was a RAAF oral history. It's on the War Memorial Access at the moment. Bobby Gibbs, who was a squadron leader with the RAAF. I'll just read that one. This is the intro. Many fighter pilots reported being unable to remember exactly the sequence of events in the brief, hot flash of a down or be downed, kill or be killed dogfight, even immediately after the event. From the moment of engagement, their minds and pulses raced. Fear evaporated with conscious thought. Whatever action was taken, however violently the aircraft was manoeuvred or its weapons unleashed, combat was usually recalled in a handful of bright, dislocated images. So this is the quote. Perhaps a picture of two Messerschmitts belting down on your tail from out of the sun and already within firing range. Perhaps another picture of your cannon shells striking at the belly of a Messerschmitt and the aircraft spraying debris around. But for the life of you, you can't remember what you did, recalled RAF squadron leader Bobby Gibbs. Some pilots returned to base so hyped they were eager to take off again. Others were so sapped that they could barely function. So, you know, to get to how you try and get these great stories from people. But what I guess the point I'm trying to make is that you need a great deal of imagery to engage people with stories. And that imagery really comes from the person and the fact that that person is engaged in an experience with which they may not feel entirely comfortable, put it that way. Some of you might have read the, or I don't know who did it, one of the amazing oral histories of Ron Guthrie in Korea. Is everybody familiar with the oral history of Ron Guthrie? So I've read a couple. So he obviously liked doing an interview, and honestly, after his experiences, he deserved a lot of interviews. And he was another person who was very good at describing how things went. And I actually loved him just on a really simple point of flying at 44,000 feet. He said, I had a meteor up to 44,000 feet, and believe me, it didn't fly too well above 40. It was like a bag of bricks. And so, you know, that was sort of a great quote to think about how it was that that experience was for him. Now, you probably all know that he punched out of a meteor at 0.8 something Mach, highest ever in the world at the time, first use of the ejector seat, etc., etc. So there's a very dramatic description, a very detailed description of that. But then comes the next bit, and my chute opened, and there I was sitting there about 7 miles above the earth, sitting there in complete silence in the Irvine chute, which did its job perfectly. And then I was able to connect my thoughts, etc., etc. And then what he thought of was, he thought, oh, well, I'll probably be dying in 28 minutes because it took 28 minutes to go down. But on the way, he was gathering his thought. He said, oh, I've lost my pockets off my flying suit. Oh, I had a few rations there. And then he was thinking, oh, the design of my flying suit's not very good. No zip pockets. I've got to let them know about that. So these are just beautiful stories. What might it be to be falling down? As he said, anyway, it took 28 minutes from there to come down. So it was a long, cold ride on the way down. My oxygen bottle, I think, lasted me to about 23,000 feet, but from then on, I was on my own. So, you know, this makes a story so interesting and so rich because it's never what you expect. You know, if you imagine, or your reader, or, you know, someone who's making a movie imagines what it might be like to be falling like that, it's never going to be, oh, I'm just wondering about the design of this suit. I must let them know about zipper pockets, in between wondering about whether you're going to die or not. I've got another one, just briefly, from Vietnam. So this is from a Huey. Nose down, tail rotor up. The RAF Huey clawed its way up into the sky. Its turbines thundering, its rotors spinning with a familiar rhythmic throbbing that had become synonymous with the Vietnam War. Once clear of the range of small arms fire, the elite SAS troops on board sat back and relished the brief respite from the tropical heat as a deliciously cool slipstream blasted through the chopper's gaping side doors. Now, the reason for this isn't a particularly, you know, extraordinary story. We've all seen the choppers take off. But what makes it human is there's suddenly, you know, there's a group of SAS soldiers in there. They're all hyped up, ready to go. And they just have that little moment of respite because it's bloody hot, as you know, from, you know, Vietnam. It's bloody hot there. They just have this delicious, cool breeze blow over them. And that becomes a really beautiful little human moment, and that changes the story. So, okay, I don't want to take too much more time because Michael's got to say some stuff too. So how do you actually get all this stuff? How do you get this beautiful stuff in your interviews? So, of course, you would start with the basics, which are who, what, where, when, how, and why. Is everybody familiar with the who, what, when? You probably all know that. That's your factual skeleton. And honestly, we all forget stuff. If you forget stuff, ring up and get the name, the time, whatever. Okay. But how then do you go on and get the color? Because you might have found in your interviewing that what's sometimes really, really frustrating is that people don't provide you with these beautiful quotes. They provide you with these incredible generalities, which is, hey, what was it like in, I don't know, let's say Sinai? Oh, it was a real eye-opener. Now, if you drill down hard on that answer, that means nothing because it's not an eye-opener unless you know it was an eye-opener from what to what. Or, oh yeah, it was really difficult. Again, it's a generality. You don't know why. You don't know what's difficult about it. And remember, your audiences in the future, your future people that are digging in won't know why it's an eye-opener from 2020 to 2040. So you've got to have, I guess, a few more strategies. I think for your chronologies, one of the things I really love about interviewing people and following their life story is finding the fork in the road. What is the fork in the road that led a person maybe away from being a checkout chick at Woolworths to taking a decision that led them somewhere else? So this is really, really interesting. So if you're thinking about your chronology, nearly everybody is going to have some really fascinating fork in the road. You know, what is it that happened that propelled them along the path to where they are now and why you're interviewing them? So that's one good thing. In terms of getting the visual snapshots, that actually, in my view, requires quite a lot of work. If you're in one of my classes, I'd probably give you the interviewing 101, but I can just explain it. And again, if I'm telling you stuff you know, I apologize. I don't, know where everybody is at with their interviewing. One of the exercises, I guess, that I would do with students is, Father Brown, how is the drought affecting you, Father Brown? Okay, Farmer Brown, not Farmer Brown, not Father Brown, Farmer Brown. So, a farmer would most likely say to someone who's interviewing, oh, it's really awful. Okay, so that's not going to be very much good to you, is it? What you need is the whole picture. So to elicit a description, sometimes you have to actually walk someone through in a huge amount of detail, a particular event. So if you think back to what we were talking about before, the storytelling. So as you're doing your interview, you come across something that you think fits really well with this idea of a great story. And then you might say, okay, for this particular event, I'm going to focus in on this in a really, really detailed way. For example, if you had Farmer Brown with his terrible experience in the drought, again, a generality that doesn't give you any information. It's like, how was your holiday? It was great. All of the things that are just normal standard ways of talking aren't going to hold up in the future when people aren't familiar with what you're talking about. So if you were trying to find out about the drought, you might say, oh, okay, what crops do you usually grow here? How long has this been a cornfield? What were your yields during good rain? What was your profit? What did it look like during wet years? What's your income? Oh, how many, dollars less? What have you had to give up? Oh, you're thinking of packing up and leaving? How long's your family been here? Oh, 7 generations. Tell me about them arriving in at the 1800s. And for all that work on that one little scene, you might get something like this. 7 generations of Browns have farmed the same patch of land carved out of the bush with axes and saws, one tree at a time. Now Farmer Brown says he can barely put food on the family table as he surveys the cracked, dry earth, which was once his lush, profitable corn farm. And it's his family which may be the last in line. If the weather doesn't break, he'll have to pack up his ute, drive away, and try not to look back. Does that make sense? That you're actually out there harvesting all these little bits so that you can put together a scene. And I've read a lot of oral histories where I think, oh, I want to use that scene, but I just don't have enough detail to imagine it or to see, how would I recreate that? So, yeah, I'll just have a quick look here. Oh dear, I've written here. Yeah, so don't shy away from really pedestrian things, what people ate, what they drank, the RAF culture. I put brackets, oh my God, you didn't treat women like that, did you? Don't shy away from gathering the details of what's happening now, because that's still going to be interesting in the future. Okay, so what about feelings? And I'll get off soon, Michael, don't worry. I will just shut up in a minute. So how do you get emotions? How do you get emotions into a story? So, you might be an on-the-beat police reporter where you knock on someone's door, you stick your foot in the door and you say, how do you feel about your, Johnny being run over? And that's not really going to work, I don't think. And what's really, really interesting in people that you interview who have done really quite extraordinary things that you would imagine would elicit quite interesting emotional responses. It's when you say, oh, how did you feel? You might actually not get much of an answer. What might work better, and I think John mentioned it, I did a decade, a lot of it in conflict zones and disaster zones with, tsunamis, civil unrest, tidal waves. I went to Afghanistan, I went to Timor, etc. I did a lot of interviews with people that had experienced really difficult and challenging things. And I actually found that part of the way that is most successful to find out how people felt is to just get them to tell you what happened. When people walk you through the story, they will often end up telling you how they felt as that unfolded. Does that make sense? or they might tell you something that doesn't actually say, oh, I felt really scared or sad, but it stands in for that. And I remember one being in Bangladesh, interviewing an old lady who'd survived a tidal wave and lost the rest of her family, and she'd ended up in the top of a palm tree. And she wasn't, of course, able to tell me, I wasn't going to be able to say, how do you feel about losing 11 members of your family, for example? But her grief was all focused on the fact that she was an old lady and her sari had been torn off. And so she was naked. And this was so grievously in a Muslim society. And so you may find other ways that people express how things were for them. Or you may get an answer that you weren't really expecting, but again, it's a really good answer. I'll just read it to you. And this is coming from Ron Guthrie as well. It's about someone asking him whether, they were actually prepared for what they faced in Korea. And he says, I said that we were ill-equipped to do the job that needed to be done, but it had to be done. There was no two ways about it. We didn't stop and weigh it up and sort of decide that we wouldn't do it because that was out of the question. We just did the job because it was there and had to be done. We coped as best we could and with what we had, and I think that is reflected in our situation over the 3 wars, Korea, World War II, and World War I. So those sorts of answers too are really, really good. They're not going to say, oh, I was scared, blah, blah, blah. But, I think that really gives you an insight, and to me, that gives a real picture of someone in that situation. The last couple of things I wanted to say was, how do you frame your questions? Do you go in and throw out a great big open question and say, hey, friend, tell me about X, Y, and Z? Or do you go into a very narrow question and say, can you tell me what happened on date X, Y, and Z? That's probably something that you have to feel your way through. Some people are really quite, I think they're quite disoriented with a really big open question. It's really hard. If you imagine someone says to you, hey, John, what's the most interesting thing you've ever done in the RAAF? That's a really difficult question. So I think that it's really good to be well prepared in terms of what the person you're interviewing has been through, so that you're not going to bamboozle them with a question that is too wide. If your question's too narrow, were you in China during the Sichuan earthquake? The answer just might be yes, and then you've got nothing either. So you've got to work between that huge open question. And open questions are fishing expeditions. And again, sometimes you can get some of the, the greatest stuff. So don't not go fishing. But you do need to have a very good idea of what the person has done. And I think that the other thing that I've noticed in reading some interviews is just be aware that if you are interviewing a peer, your peer will not necessarily explain to you the whole story, because they will know that story, and there will be, it's sort of like in journalism, you call it inside baseball, which is a bit silly in Australia, but it's obviously an expression that came from the US, which is where two people sit down and talk to each other and they know the topic, which could be really, really useful, but they forget to think this is going to be read by someone in 50 years, in 20 years. Hey, a great Hollywood producer, if Hollywood's still a thing, maybe it's Bollywood, is going to come to Sydney or Canberra, and they're going to look at this story, and two people have been talking about something, maybe a plane, maybe an event, maybe a relief operation, maybe koalas on laps in the fires, whatever, all these wonderful stories. And they assume so much knowledge that the transcript or the tape doesn't give you those whole stories that you need to recreate it and to feel that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've noticed that I've actually used up my half hour, which means Michael is going to tell you some things, and he's going to probably tell you, don't know, maybe something completely different, because it's one of these things, it's very subjective. What works for someone like me might not work for someone like Michael. I don't know, but I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say.
Well, I think we just may as well just go straight to questions, because you have said almost exactly
Oh no.
my entire catalogue of tricks, and so brilliantly expressed, Louise. So thank you so much for that. Really, there's so much I can concur with completely in what you were going to say. So rather than repeat it, I'll just give you a little history of how my interviewing came about, and it's in the three books that I did. This was, well, was there was Flack, and was about over 10 years ago now, and Fly, and the last one was Heroes of the Skies. So in all about particularly what John was alluding to before, over a couple of hundred interviews I recorded of veterans of the Second World War, and about half of those ended up in the book. So as I was saying the other day, John, there's a great cache of unwritten up interviews with these fellas who are almost all gone now, which is why I did it. So that gets to the kernel of the idea of why I started. And it all started actually through another writer friend of mine called Peter Wilmoth, who's a very well-known former Age journalist. And he's written all sorts of wonderful biographies of sports people and all sorts of things. But he was writing the biography of Bud Tingwell, who you mentioned before, Louise. And as many of us do know, Bud was actually a fighter. Well, he was actually a fighter reconnaissance pilot. He very proudly said that he went through the whole war, never fired a shot. He flew Spitfires and Mosquitoes in PRU squadrons and had an extraordinary war. And Peter was doing his biography, and Peter would come to me saying, look, I'm doing his war chapter, but I don't actually can you help me with some of the technology here? And I said, well, what is it? And he said, well, it's a 20 millimeter cannon, and they're just explaining a Mark V and what's the difference between a normal Spitfire and one of those amazing baby powder blue painted pointy-winged, high-altitude, pressurized Spitfire reconnaissance planes, and what they were like. And as I started talking about it, he said over coffee, Joe, you know a lot about this. You should do your own book. And it was one of those moments that it took to, lift a cup to your lips. I had the whole kind of, in this strange vision, oh, yes, of course, just go around, track down some people who are in the Air Force, who've never told their story before, and get their stories and put it in a book. And I said, what do you think about that? He said, that'd be a good idea for a book. So why don't you ring my publisher? So this is the most bizarre day of my life, because it all happened in a day. And so I rang his publisher, a guy called Tom Gilliat, who's now the head of nonfiction at Allen and Unwin. I said, oh, look, I've never written anything. I had written a few little articles, but I've got this idea for a book, and it really is just going around to old Air Force pilots and airmen and getting their stories and putting them into a book. And what do you think about that? And there was a pause, and he said, give me 400 words. I said, okay. I said, when do you want it? And he said, 5 o'clock today. I said, oh, okay. So I went home and backed out 400 words and sent them in just so he could see that I could write. Heard nothing back for about 3 weeks. And I'm thinking, oh, well, that didn't happen. And bad luck, move on to the next. But it's a good idea, though. It's a good idea because, and the more I thought about it, the more if this publisher doesn't want to do it, I'll find another. Tracking down these people who've carried this extraordinary time of their lives with them for 70 odd years now, and their stories are amazing. I've always been interested in ever since I was a little kid, and I still think it's a good idea. And I was sort of ruminating on that when one morning, about a month after this exchange with this publisher, I got an email, I remember turning on my computer, this ding, is an email from Pan Macmillan, publisher, and Michael, Tom Gilliatt here. Please call me immediately. And I knew it was one of those emails that could only be good news. If a publisher rings you and wants you to call him immediately, it's only good news. And it was good news. He said, look, sorry about the delay. I had some holiday and blah, blah. And he said, look, I took it to people. I took it to our publishing committee, and they said, yeah, look, that's a good idea. Give him a go. So yes, you have a contract. I said, right, okay. So now I had to do the book. And I said, when do you want it by? And, you know, he gave me a timeline, which I thought was very, very short. So I had this experience of what do I do now? I hadn't actually thought it through. How do I track down these people? And I happened to be doing a play at the time about, you know, it was kind of a nice sort of touchy-feely, a bit limp actually, play about fatherhood. And it was all a bit neither here nor there. I wasn't very fond of the play, but we managed to get a spot on the Bert Newton show, me coming on and talking to Bert Newton live on air in a couple of days' time to talk about the play. And the producer of the segment rang me and said, oh, good, hi, because I'd met her before. And she said, oh, how are you going? Yeah, look, so you're coming on to talk about this play. So, yep. Yeah, so, okay, tell me about the play. I told him, oh, yeah, that sounds interesting. Like I could almost detect her yawn. What else are you doing? I said, well, as it happens, I've just been commissioned to write a book, and I have to track down a whole bunch of ex-airmen who flew in the Second World War and get their stories. And she went, oh, that sounds interesting. And so she said, well, I think Bert would like to talk about that. I said, well, okay, but we got to talk about the play. That's why I'm actually here. So yeah, no, absolutely, talk about the play. So and he said, well, what he'll do, he'll just slip it in at the end, like 30 seconds. And so what you should do, you should get a email address. So I remember it's so long ago, it was a Yahoo address. Who remembers Yahoo? So I had a Yahoo address and like World War II airman story, something like that. And please, and we'll put that up as a super on the screen, and Bert will mention it after we've talked about the play, and it'll get out there. So there we are, 10:30 in the morning, because it was all live to air, and I go into this tiny studio, which is at the corner of Channel 10 studio, at the corner of Toorak and Chapel Street. And there you are in this tiny studio, and you sit down on the ad break, and you come in and you sit down, and there's Bert with his enormous head that looks about that big, larger than life. And it's all the ad break, and people rushing around. A TV studio is very exciting, and the producer of the play was just in the wings about 3 or 4 feet away going, yes, we're going to get some traction for this play that I'm doing, that I put all my money into. and I'm thinking, oh, I hope we do get to mention a little bit about the book project as well as the play. And we only had 2 minutes, or 2 or 3 minutes, something like that. So the floor manager goes, 5, 4, 3, lights come up, and Bert says, hi, welcome back. I'm with Michael Veitch here, a wonderful, great friend of mine. Hardly ever met the man in my entire life. Great friend of mine doing this fabulous play. But Michael, tell us about this wonderful book project you're doing with the Second World War airmen. And okay. So we spent, I think, 3.5 minutes of the 4-minute allocation talking about the book and this brief mention of the play. The play flopped. The producer never forgave me, but I had, at the end of the day, 80 people who had contacted me saying, you should speak to my father, you should speak to my greengrows, you should speak to my headmaster, you should speak to my brother-in-law, my uncle, my whatever, you should speak to my husband. People who had never spoken about their experiences. And so I had a whole, and that was the starting block of how I approached this long, you talk about fork in the road, Louise. Well, this was a fork in the road for me.
That's a great story, yeah.
Because then I had to work out how to actually do it and how to actually approach it. And so much of what Louise has just said is so true, because I initially approached this for this very first book, which ended up being called Flack. And here it is. It's like 25 men who I'd never met before. Here's me, stranger, you know, the age of their grandson or son at least, kidding myself, son, maybe even older son, rocking up to speak to them about the most extraordinary period, always the most extraordinary period of their lives. Initially, I approached it as a sort of a story gathering thing. So the first couple was I took the approach of, oh, tell me what you did during the war. And it didn't work. And I couldn't get what I wanted because I've always been interested in people and people's stories. I needed the person. And they wouldn't give me the person. They just gave me a kind of a rote reply. Oh, well, you know, I didn't really do much. They always said that. You know, you should speak to Jock. He did much more than me. Well, Jock's been dead 10 years. Can't talk to Jock. Sorry about that. And then I realized what I was doing wrong. I was trying to kind of voyeuristically extract a portion of their lives, a very important, very often very traumatic period of a person's life that often only lasted months, usually a few years, but no more than that, of course. But of course, looking back on the relief map of one's life, there's almost nothing that can replicate the experience, good and bad, of going to war. It stands out like on that relief layer. If you look back and you're in your 80s, which these fellas were, some even into their 90s back then. This is over 10 years ago, I remember when I started. They look back and this period, monsters over everything else. Mm. And the irony is that often they haven't spoken about it because of several reasons, which we'll get to, but you're the one that has to go in and pull it to pieces. Mm. But I realized I couldn't do that only by honoring this little section of their life. To honor a part of a person's life, you have to honor all their life. You can't just take it out of context because it just doesn't work. I never, just in any of the stories of the men I interviewed, I never simply went straight for the guts of it, because you can read that in a book. You can read something like it usually in something else, but I wanted to do something different. So after the first couple of interviews, I changed my approach. I made them much longer. I said, oh, I'll need 3 or 4 hours. And they said, oh, really? Yeah, about 3 or 4 hours. And you got to be careful because these people were old and often they didn't want to do 3 or 4 hours. They had to have a sleep or have a nap or something or have treatment or just they got tired. But my first question was always, where were you born? Tell me about your father. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about where you grew up. What was your school like? Were you just the normal things of a person's life? Because often if people were reluctant to tell you, if people were reluctant to sort of go into the kind of juicy pits, they were never reluctant to tell you about where they were born. Nobody doesn't have a story to say when you say, where were you born? I was born in the Box Hill Hospital, and my mother was, I was an afterthought. My mother was 3 weeks late. They didn't know what had happened. There was a bit of adventure around there, but everyone's got a story about it. So, and particularly with these men, I found that then I found that they wanted to rush forward and talk about the war. And I said, no, let's talk about when you were 10. You don't spend all day on that, of course, but you get these people into the notion that I'm interested in you, not just for what you did in the war, for what you did, for what your life has meant, both to you and other people. So I found that if you honor a kind of a timeline with these people, and I think everyone's like that. If everyone wants to do this with the veterans of Vietnam or Korea, because the second ones are all effectively gone. But so much knowledge has been lost, is still out there to be gained by our experience in the Vietnam conflict and subsequent conflicts too, of course, of which my knowledge is terribly embarrassingly scant. Sorry, John, I should have said that. You'll probably take my commission away now. But I found that if you if you have the respect of asking about what a person's life meant up to this period they're interested in, they'll give that respect back by telling you things they never expected to tell you. I can't tell you the amount of times over the 3 books that I wrote that I had people at the end of the interview session or the series of interviews, sometimes in tears, but so many who said, I have spoken about this, but never like this. I never thought I would because of what I just told you. And I was a bit of a bastard because once I got a sniff of something, I was a bit like the turn of the screw, because whenever I got a sense, it helps having a background knowledge of what they're talking about, which was always helpful, and often I would have to have a little game with them, and these fellows would test me. And said, oh, yeah, well, I started my tour on a Manchester. You probably haven't heard of a Manchester. And I said, oh, yes, I've heard of a Manchester. I certainly I would talk about the other Manchester, which was a dud of a plane, and talk about how the Veitch engines used to disintegrate and they were crap, and talk about the different, one fellow who was a Beaufort pilot in the Pacific and was speaking about, oh, we had trouble with the ailerons and the aileron cable. You probably haven't heard of that. And of course, I was able to go into the story of how some of the Australian built Beauforts had some defects, and they'd go, oh, okay, he actually knows what he's talking about, or I think he knows what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. So then they would tell me stuff, and I realized very soon that it wasn't just a voyeuristic sort of information collecting exercise. It was the honoring of a person's life, and I had to treat it with enormous respect, because they just to be in a room with someone who's goes back, and this, I remember this one fellow was a Wellington pilot. He was 100 years old. It was in Wagga. I went to Wagga, and he actually put me up for the night. He was a lovely man, because he didn't want to stop talking once he'd started. But he was describing the aircraft flying this dilapidated Wellington on one of his first trips, and how he was having trouble with the trim wheel. And as he was talking about it, his hand just went down to the side of the armchair and started doing that as he was talking about it. And he was turning the trim wheel of the aircraft in his mind. He was imagining trying to fix this wretched bloody trim. And the Wellington trim tabs were notoriously weak, and the springs would break because they're all crap. They overuse these aeroplanes. And so that was the kind of what you can get from these from someone you're interviewing, if you have the empathy to go with them for the whole journey. And what they revealed was extraordinary. I'll never forget speaking to a fellow. What was his name? He was. I forget his name. Walter Ecott, and he was one of the people that founded the Oddbod organization for Australian airmen who were in the RAF and came back after the war, and they didn't have any associations to march with, because all their blokes were in RAF Squadron associations, excuse me, over in the UK. So the Oddbods was sort of a catch-all for those guys. He'd been, excuse me, he'd been a Beaufighter pilot, a Beaufighter observer, a two-man Beaufighter, and had been shot, had an amazing story of being shot down in the Mediterranean, and his pilot, his pilot had been handed an aircraft that had been worked on, and the mechanic hadn't quite finished replacing the electrical coil or something like that, and he was a bit reluctant to hand it over, but he had to sign the aircraft over because they were doing a trip over the Mediterranean, attacking shipping, And sure enough, they got bounced by a couple of Junker 88s, and this pilot tried to put the boost up, and it didn't work, and the plane was slow, and there was one engine was slower than the other, and they got shot down. He was in the pilot, and he were in the dinghy. They were picked up by a German Arado seaplane and taken in a prisoner of war, and he spent the next 3 years in a prisoner of war camp. It has this extraordinary story of, at the end of the war, in the winter of 1945, when the Germans had bunked out. They were in Poland or somewhere, and they thought the Russians were arriving, so well, we don't want to be caught by the Russians, so let's walk west. So 3 of them walked west. They took all their epaulets off and walked day and night for 2 weeks across Germany, across this devastated Germany. He remembers looking up at the pine trees and thinking, oh, they really go for the Christmas decorations here. It was all the window. It was all the window from the Lancasters that had fallen into the forests after they'd bombed the city over there, and walking through the cities and the stench of death. And he was sickened him and shocked him. Made him a pacifist for the rest of his life. He said after the war, I could never swat a fly even after the war. Finds where they think they're down near the Elbe River, and they had heard someone said, oh, the Americans are on the Elbe. Well, let's get to the Elbe. And it's this blizzard storm in February 1945. They're going down a little cobbled laneway, and this snowstorm, they see the silhouettes of 2 SS men coming towards them up this little laneway. You can see their their flashes. And the 2 guys said, what do we do? What do we do? Because they know for a fact that if they get challenged, they find out that these fellas are wandering around POWs, they'd shoot them on the spot. No questions asked. Mm. So he has this, he walks past them and he says, Guten Tag. And the German officer says, Guten Tag. And they pass, and that's it. I'm sitting there at the end of this story in a sweat. It's such a good story. It's like something out of a fiction story, but it's true. His wife of 50 years is standing there in the doorway. I know John and Fredo, you've heard this story before, so bear with me. He's standing there with a plate or a cup of tea, holding it, getting cold, and her looking at him and looking at me. And she says, you know what? I've been married to him 50 years. I've never heard that before. To which his answer was, well, you never asked me, love. Because he was English, you see. So, and he tells me, this fellow he'd never met before. And that was what I learned about being able to extract stories from people. And Louise has done the same thing. And you have to, in your mind, you have to note the pieces of, the sort of pieces of humanity that stand out from the story, because that's what I think I like to read, and that's what I think my readers are interested in, the humanity of the story, not just the facts. When I went to write the book, I would put all sorts of sort of extraneous information into about who these people were when I met them and what they were doing and the circumstances with which I met them, because I think it creates a kind of empathy in your writing and it creates color. I'll just read you, this is the chapter on a fellow called Tom Hall, who was an Australian Typhoon pilot in Europe. And I hadn't been able to find anybody who did anything like that. See, I became a bit of a collector. It was kind of slightly morbid. Well, I've got 4 Lancaster pilots. I've got a Halifax rear gunner. I need 3 Spitfires. I could do with a Hurricane. Bud Tingwell, who I went on to interview and who actually wrote the foreword to the book, he got me my Mosquito chapter about flying the Mosquito, but I'd never had a Typhoon. And so this is how I opened the chapter. My editor initially said, do you really want to, it's a bit weird, you really want to open with that? But I did. And Tom really liked it. One very cold afternoon, my mobile phone rang. I was in the car in traffic, stationary, running late. call was crackly. I could just make out a male voice saying something about flying. The book, I would like to, Tom, typhoons, he said, and then dropped out. My heart bounced. I pulled over and checked my received calls list, a private number. I hoped he would ring back soon because the Typhoon is my unequivocally favourite aircraft of all time. Just looking at a picture of one is enough to make me happy. Silly, I know. Nevertheless, the Hawker Typhoon is my unchallenged #1 pin-up of Second World War aviation. And yet the Typhoon was a brute and had one of the dodgiest beginnings of any aeroplane. I'm going to talk about the plane a bit more. So I was looking forward to hearing from my unknown caller about Typhoons, but he didn't ring back. I waited and I waited. Weeks went by. Damn. I'd never met a Typhoon pilot, and my project would not feel complete without doing so. A month or so went by. A colleague who knew someone who worked at a radio station mentioned to a mutual friend that someone had tried to contact me about some old bloke, quote unquote, who was a pilot and who had talked about it on the radio. That was me, because I talked about it and someone had rang in, blah, blah. I tracked a name. Apparently a man by the name of Tom Hall had called up a few weeks earlier and had talked about flying Typhoons on D-Day. A week later, I was standing in front of a modest suburban unit on another dismal, overcast day. "Have you read my book?" was Tom's opening remark. I hadn't. He seemed unimpressed, and a paperback was placed in my hands, Typhoon Warfare, Reminiscences of a Rocket-Firing Typhoon Pilot. $20, he says. And that was my beginning of my interview with Tom Hall. But that's the sort of colour I can think you can bring to an interview to underscore the character of a person, because the character of a person your interview sort of rides headlong, I think, with the story. What the person did and who the person is to me inextricably linked. Because really, and I think Louise would agree with that, whenever you read about someone's experiences, whatever they are, what your brain is doing is actually turning it into what would that experience be like for me if I did it? If I was that person in that cockpit, if I was that person on that mountainside, if I was that person on that ship, whatever, you feel it emotionally because you're feeling the experience. And to feel the experience better, getting to know the person whose experience you're writing about is the subject of your writing, I think is vitally important. Some of the other, and in my show Flak, I talk about, the stage version of Flak, I'm sort of going, my mind's going back to it, actually. One of the most, I think almost the most standout story I ever heard was from a fellow who had never actually told it before. And when you realize what the story is, it's so extraordinary that you can't quite believe it. And I'll give it to you very simply. He was a very, very sweet man who was a pilot in a 467 or 460, I can't remember, an Australian squadron at the end of the war. And his aircraft was late taking off for some minor mechanical issue. Had to do a catch-up leg. The target was in northern Germany, had to do a catch-up leg over Sweden, ended up straying over neutral Sweden. Sweden defended their neutrality voraciously at times and opened fire on him. And he saw these shells. He saw an illuminated city, because they'd never seen, flying over a blacked out continent for 3 years, had never seen lights before. And these guys were mesmerized. Said, "Look at the lights down there." And it was Helsingborg on the border down with Denmark. And he saw these red shit. He thought they were other neon lights, but they were red, like a red bunch of grapes coming up. And they impacted his aircraft and made the aircraft unflyable, severed the control cables, and he had to get out. The intercom went, and he went out. He got out of his seat and got the flight engineer and hit the flight engineer on the back saying, "Jump, we got to jump," and was going back to the navigator and wireless operator's compartment behind the bulkhead. And all he remembers, he said, was a big white light. and nothing. And then I remember now Louise was telling us about a fellow in their moments of impending doom, what they think about. And this fella said, look, I was completely calm. I of course, I thought I was dead. And all I could think about was, I wonder what's going to happen now. Big question. But I was quite comfortable and I was floating. I was no pain. And all I kept thinking about was my mother and how upset she's going to be. And then I saw in front of me something which distracted me. And you remember seeing the brown and a bit of tan and green, which of course is the camouflage. And he didn't know what it was. It was like a cowling flap or no, not a cooling flap. The blankets didn't have those, but whatever it was camouflaged and it was spinning. He could touch it. It was a bit of metal. He was, hang on, this looks like a bit of a plane. And he said, my brain just sort of cranked up like an old clock. And he put one idea on top of the other. And he said, if that's a piece of the plane, it means the plane's in pieces. Now, why would the plane be in pieces? Oh, that's right. I was flying and I was shot at. So we've probably exploded. So, okay, I've got that bit right. The plane's exploded. What happens then? It's in pieces. And that's one of the pieces. So I'm probably one of the pieces. So that means we're all falling to the ground. So I better open my bloody parachute. And so he went, vroom, and then this reverie was cut and boom. And then he heard the noise and felt pain and was freezing cold and watched this. It's incredible when you think about it. He watched this kind of falling junk pile of his disintegrated Lancaster sheer away from him, go fall down because he was in a parachute, and he saw the whole fuselage in flame. He saw, he remember seeing the whole tail, horrible, the whole sail section with his rear gunner mate in it, tumbling arse over and then impacting on the ground in a boom, a big fireball. And he went, shit, where am I? Came down in a muddied field, almost completely unscratched except for a little cut above the nose, and started walking around thinking he thought he was in Denmark actually. So he thought the Germans would come, pack up his parachute. So walking around, hears some dogs barking, goes into a little farm area. It's like 2 a.m. in winter, in wherever he was, where he thought he was, goes up to a door and knocks on the door, and some people open it and go, yes. And he has to point out, points to the sky, and they'd heard an explosion, and he was taken in. And he remembers thinking, there I was, having supper at a stranger's table, and 20 minutes before I'd been at 18,000 feet or wherever in the cockpit of an aircraft. Mm. Now, what experience can replicate that for the rest of your life? And this fellow lived to be, whatever. He's gone now too. It saddens me so much that they're going, because I felt like I got to know them and they me. I often found though, their wives would ring me. The ones that had wives, by the way, were in much better shape than the fellas who didn't have wives. So, gentlemen, I warn you, stay with your missus. You'll live a lot longer. Would often ring me and say, you know what you've done? You've sent him back there, and now I'm having to deal with it. And then it was always like, oh well, no, he really enjoyed it. But I could tell, like, bugger you, Veitch, you've come in and like you've got a big stick and you've stirred up all this hardened mud at the bottom of an old settle pond, and now it's all kind of, murky. But they did feel that it was a worthwhile experience for them, because one of them was he said, look, we'll all soon be dead. And yes, I haven't told it because when I came back from the war, A, no one wanted to know. B, we were told not to tell anyone, literally told, no one will be able to understand what you've been through. Forget about it. Men didn't speak about their emotions much in those days, and probably these days too much, but especially in those days anyway. And I said no one was interested. Even their children weren't interested up until very, very late in the war. So he said, it's great that you've done this for us, because I feel like I've got something off my chest. It still saddens me every day, but it's been a sadness that I've kept very, very private. And to be able to do that for me was a real gift. To be able to have a person who you respect utterly for what they did, and they never asked for much. In my play, I quote a fella who said, at the end of an interview, when I outside, I said, "Oh, look, what do you want from us younger generation? People like me come and do this now and talk about what you did during the war. What do you want? What do you expect? Everyone talks about the greatest generation, which I think is a lot of crap. Actually, I think every generation has their moments. We're probably having ours now, and he agreed. Oh yes, that's complete nonsense. My sons would have been far better than me if they'd done it. But I said, what do you actually want from us? And he said, well, just to be remembered. Not always, but just sometimes. And I think if you can do that, if you can remember anyone's memory of what they went through in their life, particularly this sort of experience, I think you've done a good job. And so that was a very rambling. What I wanted to do was just, before we get to, when you have questions, well, actually, no, look, over to you, John, because I was going to show some pictures, but I'll hand back to you. And thanks if I probably rambled on too, so I better shut up. John Martin, the host of this web.
Thanks, Michael. Look, thanks, Louise and Michael. I mean, I've written so many notes already, and I've done that obviously for a number of reasons because, we lead the oral history team. I found it quite thought-provoking, though, because you've given us, I think, a sense, or my team will have a sense of how else they can approach an interview, which is really important because I think we get a little, we go far too direct at times on what I'd call a traditional but one-dimensional list of questions. We don't get the colour, and listening to you today, and I thought you worked well as a team, and I thought, is that deliberate? Did you come together and do that deliberately? Because Louise, you talked about the story in the story, and then Michael started, and I thought, Michael, you are telling us the story in the story, one of your stories, and the detail was quite specific, but so much so that
We're a job lot, Louise and I. We're a job lot. So
so we get one for the price of two. What? Two for the price of one.
Oh no, it's double the fee.
No, we
sorry.
want.
Yeah.
That gives us two each. Yeah.
But I've got a number of questions, but I thought that was quite specific because, from what Louise said earlier on, that I was starting to see you, Michael. I was being you, Michael, while you were talking at times, and I thought, hang on, that's what Louise was just talking about, and I think it's because you're able to invent the colour of a story, which is something that I think we've got to get better at. Now, I do have lots of questions, and we have got a little bit of time, but I think if I could, thank you both again. That was very thought-provoking. There's an opportunity, though, for, I think, some of the audience now, maybe if they've got any questions, I'll let them, if we can coordinate that.
I think Louise wants to say something first of all. Sorry, John?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say one thing, that both Michael and I, the examples I used, they were pretty much all from war. I want to assure you that there's a great story in When We Didn't Go to War. I've had the benefit of doing a couple of interviews about the Cold War and what was going on, which was in a way as interesting. And even in terms of, just changes in your organisation. I mean, it's obviously, it's something I'm interested in. I'd love to find out about the kind of, I guess, the pathway for women through the organisation, from the posters that said, go home and cook the dinner, to, women flying planes, that don't feel that there's not similarly great stories in peacetime. And one of, I think, the greatest quotes I got from Leo Davies was about the F-111 and the great success it was because we didn't ever have to use it. So there, I'm just, that's just a little, it's not to in any way suggest that the war examples aren't valid, just that you have such a rich resource of stories within your organisation. And just the 1 minute story I want to tell you, which Marianne knows is quite funny, is I'm sure you probably know that the P3s were over the Cocos Islands and they were watching the Soviet test things fall down in the ocean in whatever it was, 1980 something. Anyway, there's a great story. They were taking photos of the Soviet vessels picking up the part of this spacecraft, and there was this really weird slick on the ocean. And so the Australians tell the Americans, Americans tell the British, it goes all the way around the world till it gets to the Soviets, and then it goes straight back to the ship and they get a rocket up the arse for polluting out in the Cocos Islands. And what it turns out to be is the poor cook, who was so bloody sick of peeling potatoes, was just exhausted and couldn't be bothered going down to the disposal bin, chucked all the potato peels out the porthole. So there was an international incident. So, you know, there are stories, it doesn't just have to be war, although, I mean, obviously they're good examples. I just want to assure you that whatever you do and whoever you talk to, I really liked Michael's line about honouring that person's life. And that's what I meant when I said at the beginning that I think it's important what we're doing, what you're doing, is that within this whole peace period and also peacekeeping and disaster relief, and there are so many beautiful stories in your organisation, you know, through all sorts of different themes, even just doing something about red flag, the exercises, you know, there's just so much there. Anyway, sorry.
Can I just perhaps go in at that point and just carry on from where Louise was going with that? I've given John, in fact, my DG, Air Commodore Meyer, has given John and I the task that, and it's not to belittle all the stories from World War II, but when we look at what our collection of interviews are, we've got over 1,400 interviews, of which the majority are World War II or the more recent Middle East operations. We have not a great deal on the period between. We have some on Korea, very few on Korea, very few on Vietnam, etc. And what we need to do is, you know, the generation from Korea and Vietnam, they operated closer to the end of World War II than today. We run the risk, if we don't start catching those stories, we will miss them altogether. So I really encourage everyone out there, please help us identify these people. In the past, we've been told, given direction of interview this person, because they've popped up on the radar. We haven't had a strategy about who we need to interview to fill that collection in. So I'm really asking everyone who's involved in this webinar this morning to help us find out who's out there and let us know. Our collection team all around the country, and we're growing all the time, I'm happy to throw the resources at them to go out and have chats with these people once COVID's over, and we capture these stories. So I suppose that's just an advertisement on behalf of the branch and on behalf of John's team. Over to you, John.
All right. Yeah, that's a good point. So we'll, if there's anybody out there who can help us out, particularly in the Korean, Vietnam area, yeah, we could do with some names and contacts. Look, if I could now, and I know we've got a little bit of time, but if I could ask if there are any questions, I'll throw this to the floor now. And I don't know how we manage this spreader. You're the tech boy, but it looks like we've got
Despina's got a hand up. Despina.
But you're on mute.
And people have to unmute themselves and put your hand up, actually, and wave is the best way. Jenny wants one, but
can you hear me?
Yes.
The question I had was about the time. At the time of the interview, there is a potential to touch on issues that are very deeply felt by the person being interviewed. How do you keep them safe while still extracting the information?
It's a great question.
If that's a question to me,
to anyone.
No, well, I'll just tell you that before anyone else answers, that we have gone to a lot of trouble in the last 12 months, including having one of the unis come out to see us and give us effectively an overview of how to deal with these interviews from an ethical point of view, and how they've had to deal with some of their own experiences, which some have ended up in court because people have been quite affected by them. So we do have a few strategies in place, but I'd be interested to hear from anybody in particular where they've come across that situation.
I just personally, I've been in that very situation, and it's the moment where it's interesting what's actually happening. You of course can't force anybody to say what they don't want to say. But if they do say it and want to tell you about it, I mean, not being able to tell you about it and not wanting to tell you about it are two very different things. Often I found people would be willing and actually had a need to discuss some deep trauma, but they found it difficult. So at that point, and you know, I'm not pretending to be a psychologist at all, and you do have to be careful, but I think the safest bet is to hand all power over to them, saying, you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to, but that's up to you. If you do, I'm not going to force you to say anything. Are you feeling comfortable? You have to kind of, it's that respect you have to bring to the person in the moment. And if they want to stop, you stop. I've never had anyone saying I can't go on with this. This is too awful. But I think, you know, that's what I did in a couple of instances where there were a couple of fellows that I interviewed got terribly upset about stuff they hadn't thought about for years, and you give them the option of stopping or going. And there's, oh no, I really want to tell you, but it is difficult. Just know that it's difficult. So I really appreciate it's difficult, and thank you for telling me this. Mm. And then you discuss it afterwards. Yeah. And you say, do you want me to put that in? No, that's completely fine. Usually was the answer. But you know, every situation is different, and it is a very delicate arena to go into, and you might encounter it.
All right, we've got 6 questions lined up, or 6 people lined up for questions. So in the order, it'll be Graham Aspinall, Derek Buckmaster, Peter Dunn, Gus Garside, Tony Needham, and then Phil Varbara. So let's start off with Graham Aspinall. Graham.
Thanks very much, Dave. I have just a couple of comments rather than questions. Firstly, thanks to Louise and Michael for great presentations. I could listen to them all day, I'm sure. Just wanted to thanks Michael and Louise. Just an opportunity to talk to Michael. Just a couple of comments. Probably a little bit off topic, but it does touch on Michael's varied career and life up till now. I'd be amiss if I couldn't take this opportunity, Michael, to say I absolutely loved your comedy back in the days of Fast Forward and the Comedy Company. And your skits with Steve Vizard as the flight attendants were legendary. And
Who? Who?
Yeah, selective memory loss.
Rings a bell. Look, I think both you and I, Graham, are much too young to remember anything that happened on Fast Forward. I'm certainly
well, what about
Thank you very much.
And the
I was never in that.
The skits about Skippy on the Comedy Company, they're legendary.
No, Fast Forward was Skippy. Get your bloody 80s comedy shows right.
That's right. And lastly, as I said, second comment, I just checked my bookshelf before the presentation. I didn't realise how many of your publications I had. I've got Flack, Fly, 44 Days, Heroes of the Skies, and Turning Point, and I've probably got others. So I didn't realise such a prolific writer you've been in recent years. So Bertie, thank you very much for what you're doing. You're recording history that is fast disappearing for a lot of these vets, as you've covered in the presentation. So once again, thanks to you and Louise. I just wanted to touch base with you. I'll never get this opportunity again to talk to you in the flesh. So thank you.
Never know.
Very much.
I'm not going anywhere. I'm in Victoria. I'm not going anywhere for years, probably.
Yeah. Well, I'm not coming down to you. I'm in North Queensland, so I'm not coming down to you.
Okay. Graham, Michael will pay you later for the plug for his book.
Yeah, I like that.
The check's
We've got Derek.
Thanks.
Is he after a discount for the next book, is he?
Yeah. Put me on the list, Mike. Thank you.
Derek Buckmaster.
Yeah, also echo Graham's thanks there for the presentations by Louise and Michael. So I'm, a writer and a researcher, and I sometimes have found that in the very few interviews I've been able to do around the Wirraway topic, that these oral histories are a little bit inconvenient in the sense that you've gathered a huge amount of information, and what you might hear from an interviewee is actually different from what's in some archival document that you may have written at the time. And I'm interested.
Doesn't that annoy you? I know. You've muted yourself, Derek, for some reason.
Sorry, yeah, I have a practical answer, but I'm just trying to figure what, how other people deal with that as well.
Louise?
When I was researching my book about the Great Escape, there was, even in the various inquiries, there were differences in people's memories of exactly the same event. So the group that came out with my uncle, they remembered the moments differently. And in terms of writing it into the book, I actually wrote that into the book. That, and particularly in, well, I don't know what circumstances you're talking about, but it actually, I think, can actually contribute to what you're writing, because history isn't perfect. It's not a sort of, you haven't got a camera crew there recording it. Memory's not perfect, and memories will change over time, which is also really interesting for oral histories, because sometimes people will reflect back, say some of the older fighter pilots, and amazingly really insightful stuff, which they would never have said at 22 or whatever. They would have went, it was great fun, or, whatever. So that would be my only suggestion, is that if you're a writer, that even weave that in as part of the richness of the story. Michael, what do you think?
I've encountered that many times. And other things, such as when the voice of the person who was there has a very different take on the official history, and particularly the nature of people. I'll give you an example, because it caused quite a bit of controversy for me, but I had to put it in my book about the 75 Squadron's defence of Moresby, the 44 days. The two of the most famous brothers of the RAAF are John and Les Jackson. John was killed at the end of this, as many of us would know, and his brother Les took over. And Les became a kind of a hero of the Royal Australian Air Force. He went through the whole war. He was undoubtedly a brave man, and he took over the command of 75 Squadron upon his brother's death. And then he commanded a wing later on. But the man was an absolute train wreck of a person. And but the official history, and some of the histories have him as this wonderful kind of heroic, great leader figure. You talk to some of the people who he actually led, and they all detested him. And they tell you why. They're going to read you. The man was a drunkard, and he was a divisive. He wasn't a pleasant person. He just all sorts of things. He was vindictive, and he was terrible for them. He was like not meant to be a leader. His big brother was meant to be the leader. He was not meant to be the leader. So what do you do? What do you do? You've got this recording of a man saying, this guy was, let me tell you the real story of Les Jackson, and the books, the primary sources you go through, paint him as a kind of a hero. So it's difficult. So in the end, and I had to tone it down a lot, but it was putting my oar in, actually, because I actually did a chapter on, the kind of what happens when the wrong people are put into situations of command. It becomes a failure of command because men are not being commanded properly. Their morale is being eroded, and their effectiveness of a unit is being sort of completely undermined. And happens in wartime, particularly happened in that war, because the whole thing was such a bloody panic at the start that these things happened. But the family of John Jackson, particularly John's daughter, was most upset with me. And I think still is. And I knew when I was writing it, and I went, they're not going to like this, and they didn't. But I believe I went for the truth, and I would probably publish the same thing again tomorrow.
Yeah,
it's
great.
difficult. It does make you feel good, I can tell you.
Yeah, great comments. Thanks.
I saw Tony Needham nodding his head a lot through that, and I should explain for people that Tony, Air Vice Marshal Tony Needham, works for with us and interviews all our senior officers, retired chiefs, etc. So he probably sees and hears some of those stories when he's speaking to some of our chiefs. The next up is Peter Dunn. Peter.
Thanks, Dave. Excuse me. I haven't got a question, but I've got a few tips I'd like to share. I guess my most important tip that I've learned through personal life interviewing people is don't give them the answer that you want. For example, an inappropriate question would be, was that photo taken in Townsville? Instead of asking, where was that photo taken? Right. I used to do that a lot myself early in the piece, and I've changed my tack now when I interview people. Second one is try not to interrupt them if they divert onto another topic after your question, because it could end up being a gold mine of information. And I've found that quite a lot as well. And my third and last, just a simple one, always make an audio recording as a minimum. Video is even better, but make sure you've got a tape, not a tape recorder, a digital recorder with you as well. So just a few of my tips.
Well, tick, tick, tick on all of those. And actually, Peter, hey, Peter, did you get my book the other week? I mailed some books up to you.
Not yet, mate. I don't think so.
Oh,
the other week,
okay.
Not recently.
A couple of months ago. Very late, but okay. Oh, I wonder what happened. Anyway, I did. If anyone has
they're probably stuck in Victoria with COVID.
Undoubtedly. No, I've got a couple of books on the way. Peter's Oz at War website is amazing. Is absolutely amazing. People haven't got onto it. It's just.
Yeah, no, I've looked at it. It's very good.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, we've got Michael/Gus Garside. Michael?
I was just going to make a quick comment about how to deal with an emotional response from a veteran, and I've had it happen a few times in interviews now, and I find that the most important thing is having genuine empathy for the interviewee and just letting that emotion come out. And pretty much every single time it's been fixed with a cup of tea. So you pause, have a cup of tea, have a little chat about anything to do, stuff that's got nothing to do with the interview. And then when they're ready, you sit back down and get back into it.
Michael,
Right.
I've probably got a question for you, Michael, then. Michael Garside, being a pilot, so both from your Air Force time and also up till now, Qantas, we'll put a question mark where that's going. How do you find when it comes to interviewing veterans who have got the flying experience, how do you get them to draw out those stories using your background?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting question, because generally speaking, if you speak the same language, if you speak in some sort of pilot talk, then it comes out, and it might be shooting your watch off your wrist or whatever it might be. But if you have, I think it goes back to what Louise was saying about knowing the subject. If you have some knowledge and you can make that connection, then the story comes out.
Oh, great. Right, next up, we've got Tony Needham. Sir, over to you.
Oh, thanks. And thanks to Louise and Michael for their very informative and entertaining discussion that they've led. If I could just say to Louise, I can remember helping to photograph the Russian re-entry vehicle back in mid-1983 off Cocos Island. Part of the story there is some of the headaches people had on the aircraft because how cheap the beer was at the Cocos Club where we were staying. Also, for Michael, on Typhoon and other aircraft of the Royal Air Force, I think if you also maybe one day had a look at the Sunderland, speaking from a maritime patrol background and coastal command as the Cinderella service, the Sunderland has an interesting story too to talk about if you talk to some of the aircrew there. But my question comes back to how we collect oral histories, and I guess I'm just wondering with if you've got the opportunity to collect video as well as audio, what benefit you would see in that? Because I understand that a lot of our communication as human beings is non-verbal, and so maybe you're getting something extra there that can be used in the future through using video. But then you might have subjects who are worried about telling their story on video and having a camera in their face, and that might hold them back to saying something. So any thoughts on that? Thanks.
Will I answer that one, Michael?
Sure.
I think that your most useful asset, which sounds very old-fashioned, but is the transcript, because currently our technology will help you search through that. It's very difficult. You find that you don't spend a lot of time going back to listen to 3 or 4 hours of tape or watching 3 or 4 hours of video, but that will change with technology. My personal suggestion would be that if you want to use video, you might want to pre-interview, if that makes sense. Maybe do a couple of meetings to get somebody, if you have the time to invest in this, just to get someone to be very comfortable about it. Because if you start off with the video running, I don't know how everybody else feels, but I don't think there's many people who kind of kick back and relax and, you know, have the sort of the 60 minutes in your face as you're crying. That would be my suggestion, but that's, you know, that's a very inexpert view. I think it's just from experience that sometimes you knew, and TV does it all the time, they do pre-interviews. But from your point of view, from having those assets, I don't know if this is, you know, a hard and fast rule, but you really only get about 30% of your communication from the words alone. A lot is from, you know, other, as you know, other cues. So maybe that's an idea, to get a selected amount of video. Michael, what do you think?
I agree with that. One of the other things that got me into trouble at one stage was with the AWM, because a couple of the fellas that I had interviewed had undergone interviews with the Australian War Memorial for their archive, and they had hated it. They had not enjoyed the experience at all. It actually put me behind the 8 ball, talking to a couple of them again, and I had to convince them to do it. And it's because they didn't like the camera in their face. It was very intrusive. And there's a couple of them complained about the style of interview, which was very blunt and very direct and very kind of cursory. And they didn't like it. They felt that they weren't being listened to. And I put that in the book, and I got a couple of bit of blowback from the AWM for that, which is why I've often been the AWM, and my books have rarely graced their bookshop, their sale shop shelves. But anyway, I also just, a couple of things that Peter said before, they're actually really important. That thing about not interrupting is actually a really good point. Letting a moment just sit, not being afraid of silence, to just let it be filled in. And if you, I meant to say this before, just a quick one, and I know we've got some more questions, but if you feel someone who you're talking to is skipping over something, but you reckon you've got a chance of them actually elaborating on it, I found that I would go back and say, look, John or Peter or Phyllis or whatever, I didn't quite understand, not, can you tell me that again because you're not telling it properly. I didn't quite understand what that meant. If you feign a bit of ignorance, it was actually quite a good tip for them going, oh, well, and then actually giving you the real story, and then you had it. And for people skipping timelines, like a lot of these fellas would, and it was a kind of a balance, because often they'd want to skip a timeline to tell a story, but they'd missed out on something else. So let them, if someone wants to jump ahead, let them tell a story and get the story, but don't interrupt them to say, oh, we're moving ahead. Get it and then go back, because then you'll have it. And yes, of course, record everything. I often didn't transcribe. I would just write from the tape. And because it was tapes when I started, and I did it because I wanted to convey the excitement I felt at hearing the story for the first time, rather than writing out. I was just boring. I hate transcribing anyway. But I often used to just do it that way. And I found the emotion I felt would go onto the page, but that's just me. Sorry, rambling on. Next question.
I suppose
Peter, did you just hold up a copy of a book I
Yeah, I
sent you?
did get the book.
Yeah.
I apologise. Yep.
Good.
I suppose one of the considerations we have is that we collect lots of oral histories, and I know John and I have been going great, particularly John, over the last couple of years with this, that we have so many interviews, we've hoovered them up. Probably we've only transcribed not even half of them, and a lot of them we don't know what's in there. We know that Bull Gehring has been interviewed 5 times. And so one of the big challenges we have is to make sure that we can do not only transcribe them, but do the metadata, so that when we have someone comes along to us and says, I'd like to find who you've interviewed who may have had experience X, been in Korea, quite often, sometimes we just don't know. Unless we know that person by name had time in Korea, we have to go through and go through it. And that's a significant challenge.
Yeah. You have to transcribe them, what you do, absolutely. I just don't because I'm lazy.
Yeah.
No, you have to, because people like me need to know.
Yeah, and again, I think that's one of the things that we say to our team, that there's 3 parts to doing a oral history interview. 1 is your preparation, 2 is your interview, and 3 is the housekeeping after, which is including doing all the metadata recording so we can then make it a product for people to use forevermore. So, Louise.
I just wanted to say something about that. It's a good point, Fredo. Firstly, you can get transcriptions done. There's programs to do that. You don't have to do it yourself, by the way, Michael, anymore. In terms of the keywords and linking these oral histories up, everything is connected. So I stumbled across a very interesting little part when I was going through a very, very long oral history, Ron Guthrie's, that he trained with Len Waters, the Indigenous pilot, and knew him from back in the day, or came across him in some way. And so he had a whole little section talking about how an Indigenous pilot was treated at that time. So if you have ways of connecting that all up, that's gold for you guys. It's really important.
One of the challenges we have is with our interviews, because of the sensitivities of many of the stuff that's discussed, we do have a contract to send a lot of our interviews from World War II and beyond down to this company that transcribes it. But the more recent ones, we have to do them in-house, which creates the challenge.
Fair enough.
I've got a next question is from Phil Varbra. Phil.
Thanks, Fredo, and thanks, Louise and Michael, for 2 absolutely fascinating presentations, really useful and enjoyable. Just so people are aware, the Civil Aviation Historical Society has an extensive collection of oral history recordings, which are available on the Connecting the Nation website, unfortunately not transcribed. As a researcher myself, I've been using oral history recordings, and quite often you get to a point in the recording where it's getting to the nub of what you're interested in, and you ask them about this, and of course they never do. One of the unique features of aircrew in particular is that they're forced to keep a diary in the form of a logbook. And I'm just wondering how useful you find logbooks are as a means of prompting the discussion in these kinds of interviews and sort of drawing out stories.
Who wants to go first?
I can speak to that absolutely, because one of the questions I asked all my fellows when I was speaking to arranging it, do you have your logbook? Almost all of them did. Those who had lost it, and a couple of had lost it, two of my blokes, get this, had both lost their logbooks in separate bushfires in the intervening. I suppose that's not really surprising living in Australia, but they were very upset about it too. But the logbook was absolutely vital, and you would go through it because you would prompt them. Often they haven't read it for years. They were often, especially the guys in Bomber Command, had forgotten half the trips that they did. It was all a big blur for them. So you could remind them, and often you'd bring stuff back. But oh no, anything like that to kind of pin the memory to something real is, I found excellent.
I just, say something else about logbooks. I used my uncle's logbook in a slightly different way. My uncle was one of the 50 executed after the Great Escape. So I was...
Oh.
The unsolved story. And the logbook's really useful because you know exactly where he was every single day of his flying career and doing what. You can match him then with other people who were there, and the Brits had great records.
Ooh, I think the coins are running out.
Talk, and I was lucky I did it early enough to get to Jimmy James, who was a great escape artist from the RAF, and my uncle led him out of Stalag Luft 3. So, you know, I think that the whole point of oral history really is to combine all of those elements. So the factual element is the absolutely essential foundation, and those kind of records are really, really, really important. And from that, you can find out who was there that day and might have something, who might have a picture from that day. And it's like this amazing jigsaw puzzle putting together the whole story, because there'll be anecdotes here, there'll be photos there, and it's just so fascinating to do it. So I hope you're enjoying it anyway, Phil.
Great. Next question, Mary Van Hummel.
Myself.
Mary?
I just unmuted myself. Hi. I've loved the talk. It's just so fascinating and helpful. My father wrote a book over 50 years ago, and he was a fighter pilot in South Africa. 50 years after the fact, through a series of synchronistic events, I ended up with the book. And I'm going to be doing a PowerPoint presentation, but the information to get any information on the Air Force out of Africa appears to be very difficult, because after the apartheid, they found that a lot of the information, they changed names of places, etc., and it's been difficult. And of course, that was time ago. So I know this is the Australian Air Force website, but for any researchers, is there anyone who has access to information from Africa?
Was this in South Africa?
Yes.
I did research in what was then Rhodesia in South Africa.
Yes.
I actually did it in London in Kew, because the imperial records were actually in the UK. So they even have the files of all the RAAF records in Kew as well. So I ended up going to London, and my sister helped me, and we spent days and days going out to Kew, which was, I mean, absolutely fantastic and fascinating, because you handed over these files that say declassified, you may now read this. So I think you would find that, and the other thing is the Imperial War Museum in the UK has a lot of their oral histories online that are digitally available, which is really, really useful. They've got the tapes online so you can listen to people, and their metadata is not too bad. So you may be able to, I don't know, because I don't know what squadron you're talking about, but a lot of those sorts of records were actually hoovered up by the Brits. Does anyone else know?
Yep.
I was going to say the Kew Records office too, Mary. I've been there a couple of times. It's amazing, and there's a lot of what's in their archive from the former colonies, particularly military-wise, is astonishing.
And you don't need to go. Their catalogue is online, so you can go online and you can have a look at that catalogue, and you can, some of it's even digitized, not much. When I was doing it, wasn't much was digitized, but there's a lot. So I'd try Imperial War Museum, the National Archives in Kew, and anything else, Michael?
They're the two big ones.
Yeah, the big ones.
Mary, if I can add something to that, one of the few good things to come out of the pandemic at the moment is that which has been digitised at the National Archives in Kew is free at the moment. So you can access
Really?
10 a day up to 50 a month. And they're normally about £3.50. So that's saving you some money. And quite a lot of Squadron ORBs, they're one of the few things that are digitised.
If someone could type me the link to go to, that would be much appreciated. And also, I interviewed someone who was a lady who was in the Red Army, and she has the most incredible story that needs to be told. So if anybody out there is interested in contacting her, you get a treasure load, a treasure load of fascinating story.
Great. Thanks, Mary.
Okay, thank you.
Next up, Mary Ann Whiting.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, sir. Many thanks to Louise and Michael. It was terrific. Actually, I've taken lots of notes. Thank you. I just hope I can transcribe them and read them later on. Just a couple of reflections. I know Louise talked about imagery and Michael talked about prompts. And I remember the very first interview I did with a veteran. We were just talking about general things and I wanted to get a little bit more. So I went to, not his logbook, but I found out when he was actually with 460 Squadron. And then I went to a particular raid and I just read very generally from what was recorded in the operational record book. And you could see him just sit back and he went, oh, and then he started to sort of relive the moment. And from that, just, 5 or 6 sentences, that was then just a half hour, 40 minutes of a lot of detail about just that one particular raid, which was very difficult for him. So that was very good. Also, Louise talked about at times people see the same event in a different way. Have you ever had the experience where you think someone's told very obvious porky? And I've just very recently someone contacted us and conveyed a story about someone who said, towards the end of the war, they were up in New Guinea at the time, and they were just waiting for he'd been seconded to go on an assignment in a submarine to go to Japan. Now, when I did a little bit of basic research, I thought, well, that's a bit hard. So, what do you do at times, when there's something in the back of your head, you think, oh, that doesn't read right, or that can't be possible. How would you deal with that?
You have to use your own judgment.
Yeah. Marianne, I'm wondering, just sort of nod politely and go to the next question and go and do your own research and edit that out.
Have you ever had that experience though?
No, I'm just trying to think. Not really. Although I was reading a fantastic little anecdote about the support crew for the half flight, because back in the day they didn't really have any sort of, to Mesopotamia, they didn't really have any kind of system yet, because it was the first first little foray, and they recruited a couple of guys, including a cook, and apparently the cook used to go and sit in the bar wherever they were and pretend he was the pilot. So, and tell some great stories, which I think we should put in our book, actually. It's a great little anecdote about him just sitting there, and just being in that, being that person. But in my own interviews, I guess, not so much for the military book, for a journalism career, particularly being places like Timor and places like that, people will tell you what they want you to know about a conflict, and it may not be true. So you've got to cross-reference things, I would say. Never just take one account. You would have, I imagine, done the background reading. You would have done, you would have had, before you do it, you've got a sense of what actually happened. So in that situation, I'd probably go, oh, really, that's interesting. And then I'd just go on to...
Thanks very much.
Louise has mentioned a couple of times there, dropped it in our book. For those who aren't aware of it, we have Louise, Michael, Owen Zupp, who many of you know of, working on a title for next year for our centenary. They're the leads, and Louise is the one doing all the heavy duty writing for a book that's going to be called Then, Now, Always, an illustrated history of the Air Force. And it's a very exciting project. I think they're loving it, and Louise and Michael doing a fantastic job of the research. What I would ask is, and particularly with you, Sir Air Vice Marshal Needham, we are always looking for the little stories and quotes of people that may have been involved. Now, particularly with the Air Force since 1990s on, it's hard to get some of those stories. We've been out there, so Louise has interviewed Air Marshal Davies recently. I was about to say his nickname, but I thought better not. So there's been some great stuff done there, but if anyone has those stories, serving stories, please make contact with Louise and Michael, because we want to capture those and make this book have that personal feel, not just being a tome of 100 years in a story. Okay, so at that point, what I'll do, if there's no further questions, I haven't seen one pop up, I'll pass it over to John.
All right. Okay, look, and we are just about out of time, but I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody, Michael and Louise. It's been a great webinar, and we could probably go well over the time limit. Could I put it to you that perhaps we might have another one of these, and we might pick on a particular topic down track and see what sort of interest we get, but I'm sure we'll get more. But look, your insights today, your personal experiences have been great for us to listen to. It's going to stimulate a lot of discussion in my area in particular, but I can see already other people in their research and in their own interviewing have probably taken a lot from your insights and backgrounds where you've been doing this all the time. So look, can I thank you again? It's actually been terrific, and you've given us something to think about for sure in the oral history program. And we're lucky that you're not too far away, so I'll be knocking on your door, both of you. But thank you, and perhaps
I'm in Melbourne, mate. You're not knocking on my door anytime soon.
Yeah, that'd be the webinar door, Michael.
And John, can I also say thank you to everyone for coming along, and also your, the points you raised, because, you're such an important team. What you're doing is fantastic, absolutely fantastic, and all the observations that you came up with. And yeah, I look forward to seeing more of the fruits of your labour as well. Thank you.
Yeah, you made a good point there, Louise. Yeah, and I did mean to thank everybody for joining in. It's quite a crowd today, so that just shows the interest in this particular area. So thanks everybody for listening in, and for those who have participated specifically with questions. So it's been great.
So before I wrap up, just a couple of quick plugs. Firstly, if anyone is trying to find out or make contact with us in History and Heritage for Air Force, please just drop an email to our standard, we call it our sort of front door email address. So it's hh-af.engagements@defence.gov.au, or contact me or contact John. Our emails are out there. People know who we are, and we can get you to the right people in the branch. Our goal is to try to help to meet both the government and the public's expectations of the sort of services we should provide. And by being engaged with you helps us do that. Secondly, if we've got topics lined up for the rest of this year, but I'm always looking for people who are interested to do similar webinars. So for next year, we'll probably be starting from February. I don't think anyone will want to do over the Christmas break, although Michael will probably still be in lockdown then, so you can always get him out. So yes, please just drop me a line if you've got ideas for topics. And finally, we're still trying to get the registration page up and running for this. I hope to have it by Christmas, but there's just been a few little technical hiccups. If you know people out there who would like to participate in this, just get them to drop me an email, and that way I can put them on the distribution list. I try not to send emails out to everyone in the open, so effectively I'll be blind copying everyone, which makes it a bit of a challenge sometimes when it comes to emailing people. But just to protect people's privacy. So if people want to participate, please let them know, or you pass on their email address to me and add the list to them. All right. So I think if no one else has got any other further questions, I'm happy to keep this.
I've actually got one more little tiny plug for myself. Well, it's not really a plug. It's a request. My next book actually is on the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. And if anybody out there knows any personal anecdotes or diaries or snippets of information of airmen who flew during that very important battle, I would love to hear them, because I'm finding the kind of personal stories about airmen hard to find. So that's what I'm looking for over the next year. So there you go.
Thank you, Squadron Leader Veitch.
And are you doing any plays, Michael?
I beg your pardon?
And are you doing any plays?
Oh, well, not at the moment. My play about a sailing ship and my great-great-grandfather who arrived on it, a tragic voyage of the 1850s, has been mothballed for the moment, but for next year they're putting it back on the road. The book is called Hell Ship, yeah.
And also, don't forget Louise's book, available in good bookstores.
I don't have one handy to show you.
As I said, I'm happy to keep this session open if people want to hang around. If Michael and Louise are happy to hang around for any other questions, we'll close down now, and if you want to hang around, feel free to do so. But thank you again for everyone, and a great session again. So a round of applause for Michael and Louise.
Thank you.
Virtual clapping.
Just wanted to say something. I'm Mike Fogarty. I'm in the RSL world. And to second someone's comment, firstly, congratulate you both on a wonderful address. But second, someone's comment before about you to try and gather up those from the Vietnam era. In doing so, don't forget the helicopter pilots who were...
Oh, no, absolutely
Oh,
not.
no, we're not forgetting them.
No.
Nine Squadron and 4,
Yep.
what was it? Or what was the other one?
9, I think.
5, sorry. 5.
Yeah.
5 Squadron.
I've got a lead into one, and in fact, I forgot about the bloke. I used to work with him at an auction place, and suddenly realised what he did. And of course, in the days when I worked with him in 1980s, it didn't really mean much, but it certainly does now. But I'm probably very keen to sort of contact Anzac House and see if they can put out a general notice to all sub-branches to try and gather up there's not many Second World War. In our sub-branch, I think we've got 8 Second World War veterans left, but certainly a couple, not a lot of Korean, but some, and certainly some Vietnam era. And also I'm involved with Legacy. I know in Legacy House, there's not a lot, but there's some there. One I can think of who flew Caribous, but maybe through Anzac House, if they could send it out through all the sub-branches and see if they can spread the word about gathering some information from those out there who sometimes are a little bit shy they're keen to talk about it, but they're not coming forward much. Only got to ask the question and they will speak.
Can I put an idea out there? And John and I were looking at this last year. One of the challenges we have is that sometimes there's people out there who have really good stories and people out there who want to tell a story, but perhaps, there's not enough there to interview. So we were actually planning to put, it's almost like, I wouldn't say a questionnaire, but a performer out there through the associations and the like, so we can get people to identify, to write down their little points about who they are, what they've done, and if they've got any stories, it's a 1-pager or a 2-pager. We don't want them to write back with their war and peace response, but so we can then catalogue them and then know if we need to, if we can prioritise the interviewing strategy. Also, again, one of the questions is, have you been interviewed before? So as Michael said, we always have the challenge that we go to interview someone and they say, but I've already been interviewed by the War Memorial. And we're trying to build links with the War Memorial and share interviews. They're a bit reluctant sometimes to do so. So, does anyone have any ideas? Would that be something we can do? Because again, we have people all around the country now, Darwin, Perth, everywhere. All I need to do is, if I know there's someone there and they appear on our radar as being a high priority, we can get them prioritised to do an interview. Any comments?
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
Mike, where are you located?
Which Mike?
You.
I'm located outside here because I've got to feed the magpie.
All right. No, which town?
Well, I live in Canterbury, but I'm the immediate past president of the TRAC RSL.
Canterbury is in Victoria, Canterbury.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Victoria.
Okay. I was thinking Canterbury, Sydney. Okay. All right. So Michael Veitch is one of our two down there, and we've got another gentleman, Steve Campbell-Wright, who'll be coming onto our team in the new year. So we've got a couple of people in Victoria. So again, what I'd like to do is have you make contact with them, or even with John, so we can get those list of names and work with you and the associations you named and Legacy to actually work together in capturing these names and doing it together. I think the biggest issue is, for a period of time, Air Force has probably been looked as, we've been removed from doing this. We want to be part of it. We want to help everyone. And in doing so, we'll all become a network to make sure we can maximize the resources we have.
Fredo, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I think somebody else was. I had breakfast this morning with a friend from a woman from the Army. She'd been to a couple of what are they called, focus groups, but they were all on Zoom. I think it was with Veterans Affairs, and they're trying to capture women in the Defence Forces stories because they're so underrepresented. Now, I don't know anything about this program, but she'd been to it. Is there something within the oral history program that we should be doing about capturing the women during the women's story during the period of coming up to where we are now? Is that something that's on the radar?
Can I just say that that's a great question. There's actually a number of elements that we touched on this earlier. There's a number of elements insofar as the interviews goes, and we have not really interviewed them. And women are one of those, but we've talked, Fredo and I have talked more recently about themed interviews. So, we're talking now, all right, women, Indigenous, let's put some more interview horsepower in there. But even the themes, now we're getting into trade. So, all right, we have got to focus on aircrew. That's fine. But what about those people that are, in the medical field, the health field, the logistics field, the engineering field? Some of the stories that Fredo and I have talked about capturing now go to those folk that have been involved in some of our major acquisitions, like the F-35. Talking to them about the challenges that they have had. Now, that has not ever been part of the strategy from what I can see, but neither has trying to balance the books up on a whole raft of subjects, including women. So I think one of the areas that we've improved to do this now is just the sheer workforce that the boss, the DG, has given us, so that we've got them all over the country. Even yesterday, I had a great to Linda New, who I saw her light up there on the screen before. And Linda is now looking to give us some time to do some oral histories. And I said, Linda, it'd be great to have you on the team because I need women on the oral history team as well. So we're starting to change where we can. That same focus we've had on, let's say, males, flying and in operations, to a much broader cross-section of the Air Force.
Oh, there's great stories there. And you don't just need women to interview women. I think that if women interview men, you get different stories as well.
Yeah. I think the challenge we have in our team at the moment is, as John said, we're trying to establish our new direction. There is a degree of crawl, walk, run. And if you look at perhaps where we were 12 months ago, we would have had 3 people on the team, John? 4?
Yeah, about 3.
I think we're out to about 10, and we're growing now. And we're getting more people keen to help us. The beauty we have, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. The centenary next year is putting a lot of onus on us to focus on that. And therefore, we've got to then be thinking, well, 2022 and beyond. One of the challenges that we are trying to do is to make sure that when our centenary is over, people just don't then brush off their hands and go, well, that's it. We don't need to worry about Air Force history any longer. So we are using this current period and next year, and while we're busy focusing on the centenary, to plan out what our strategies will be for longevity past 2021. And those various things, as John said, picking the themes, not just going out there and, no offense to people, to Tony Needham is interviewing the senior officers, and what we tend to call the horizontal interviews of person's life from birth till current day, but actually trying to explore some of those topics that just probably wouldn't get the light of day otherwise, and going and digging in there. And yes, we still need to get, I'll call the head and tail of, their life story, but digging into some specific stories that we can put there for the people in future. So I talk about in 20 years' time, when someone wants to write the story of the F-35 program, noting that project's been going 20 years now, we've got next to nothing in our records on that, because no one is thinking now, apart from us, about documenting it for the future.
Mm.
No, it's what we said earlier on. So when you think.
Oh, someone's phone. All right. Any other comments, questions, anyone? Yeah. Oh, Anna's got a hand up. Hello, Anna.
Hi, Fredo. I just wanted to say, in my research, I'm finding that people are not really considering that their stories are that important, so they're not willing to say. So what we need to do in documenting the history of the Air Force is, I guess, sort of get rid of that hierarchy of values within the individual, to let people think that, to value their own contribution. It's, it's ground crew as well as air crew. It's everyone, different pieces of the, the aeroplane.
Yep. No, that's a very good point. And I actually had a meeting at the War Memorial last Friday, and the War Memorial has started to plan their redevelopment of their collection. And they're looking for people to provide artifacts for display. And they said the biggest challenge they have is that the average person out there who may have been deployed somewhere thinks that they've got nothing of interest. So, they think, oh, it's about the air crew, it's about the pilot, it's about the aircraft that drop the bombs. They're even looking for simple things like the day glow vest that Air Force people wear to have Air Force front and back, because that tells a story about what we do when we're doing humanitarian disaster relief. But no one tweaks to those little things. I think that's a similar story to what you're saying there, Anna. But it can go from the very top to the very bottom. We've got to make sure we get that whole range.
And just to follow up on Fredo, one of the other target areas that we have for interviews, although it's sort of been shaped by the Chief of Defence Force, is that we are looking to interview people who were involved in bushfire assist and COVID. So there've been plenty of military people who have been involved in both of those operations. So they're a target area for us to interview as well.
And first responders?
Which Mary are the first responders in a lot of cases. So we want to get their stories, and I can tell you they come from all walks of life in the services, and in the Air Force, there's no one immune from being chosen to go away and support the community in those sorts of roles.
I think Dion was waving his hand.
Yeah, I just had a comment on the earlier comment, but it's all related to who you're talking to, and I've met a lot of air crew and ground crew over the years, people who work in the background, and some of them have amazing stories. In fact, I think I learned a lot more about the Air Force through them than I ever did maybe from just the frontline pilots, etc., that I've spoken to. And some of them have some amazing artifacts or pieces that they've acquired or been presented over the years with stories. And I find just to ask them about that item sitting on the shelf, you get the whole story. And I can indeed recommend a friend of mine who was basically he worked on airframes and engines back in the day. I think the musterings were split a bit more later on. And I worked with him down at Point Cook as well and at the RAF Museum. He was at FTS. But he has, for instance, a piece on the shelf, and it's a little green sort of Duvalaki. You sort of look at it and you say, well, what's that? And it's like, oh, that came off the Zero. And the War Memorial Zero was restored up at 2AD, or at least work was done up there. So that elicits a whole story. And then, of course, you just can keep talking and talking for hours. So people like that need to be interviewed as well. And it's hard, but I think we all need to remember the people we've met and try and get them involved. Direct them towards what you guys are doing, or if they're comfortable, talk to them ourselves.
So I should say with Wang and Gus Garside, I think Gus has just dropped out. They'll probably be upset by that because we all know the world revolves around aircrew. You know.
Oh, okay.
How many pilots does it take to change a light bulb? One. He holds the bulb and waits for the world to revolve around him. You know.
I was going to say before Gus is talking about interviewing pilot speak, small words work for us.
Pictures, crayons.
Yep.
Dion, I should say, there's something that I got from my days in the engineering world. You know.
Nice. Yes.
The standard style of it. Yeah.
Very, very nice indeed. Yeah, that came out of the yoke, did it?
It did.
I've sat staring at those for about 3,000 hours, mate. As long as it's up the right way, I don't care.
Anyone else got any questions, comments?
Yeah.
Oh, Rick?
Firstly, thank you to all for the contribution today. For me, who's sort of very much the novice looking on about oral history, it's been, 8 pages of notes from me. So nothing was too simple or wasted on me. And I appreciate going to that level of detail, in particular, Louise. But again, very interesting to listen just in the last couple of minutes. There's actually more than just engineering and aircrew. We've also got clerical, administration, and based on my hair colour, butchers, carpenters, electricians, airfield engineers. So there's a whole heap there that's just not even being touched.
Yeah.
And some pretty good firemen as well. So there's a heap of stories out there that we haven't even tackled as part of that centenary.
Don't forget the chaplains.
Chaplains, yes.
Yeah, very much, very much so.
And so true, that comment about people thinking that they haven't done anything important. I once met a bloke who'd won the CGM. He had to try. He spent an hour convincing me that he'd done absolutely nothing. So, and of course he hadn't. He had an extraordinary, but you know, that natural modesty. But yeah, always the way. And you have to kind of not convince them, but you know, the power of being listened to is something that you can't underestimate, because and often these older people that don't get listened to much, as we get listened to less and less as we get older, but to have someone come and actually have a specific interest in what they've done, it's a very powerful force, and don't underestimate it when you wield it.
That's an interesting observation, Michael, because one of the challenges, you know, our task is to actually do these interviews. But apart from the fact that we're trying to capture the stories, we also recognise that one of the responsibilities we have is that, I'll put it probably bluntly, the feel good. We potentially, we are interviewing a lot of people that we have a limited resource, and therefore it's very hard for us to cover everyone. But we are interviewing people sometimes, even though we know that their story may not rank against some of the many other ones we're trying to capture. It's to that, make sure they're listened to. And, you know, we have a responsibility in the Air Force to pay attention to our veterans and recognise their service. So that comes into our considerations.
You know, another story I think we should capture too is you know, our gay and lesbian community. Because, you know, some of those people, I mean, I'm sure Rick could tell you, I can know when I first joined the Air Force, I knew that some of my senior NCOs were gay, but they couldn't talk about it. You know, there would be the brother that's, you know, that they're living with, and that's like, oh, gee, they must have had different mothers. You know, they don't look anything alike. But, you know, and we didn't have that, you know, that the US said, you know, don't ask, don't tell. And I know when they brought in, what do they call it? Interdependent partnerships. That just came in, just happened, you know. There was no big fanfare. It just sort of slid across. That was it. But all those people have got a great story to tell, you know, and we should be capturing that, because now it's sort of like, well, who cares? But, you know, we need to have that story. I think it's very important. And I know a few people could really give some really good background just to you know, to some of the things I had to put up with.
Anyone else? I think we're at it. Anna's there busily doing, she's at her work in the bowels of a basement somewhere, listening. All right, everyone. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, I'm looking forward to speaking to more of you in future. And yeah, all the best. Oh, sorry, is Mike waving goodbye?
We're just waving goodbye.
He's waving goodbye. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Really
Louise.
enjoyable.
Thanks, Michael.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.